Chicago, River North, Friday night, November 9th, 2019. I didn't know it yet, but 3 routine pickups would end up rewriting everything I believed about the living, and whatever sits just outside that boundary. I was behind the wheel because I needed the steadiness, the repetition of routes, the glow of streetlights on wet pavement, the little rituals that made the nights feel predictable after a breakup I still wasn't done untangling, and a job loss that left my calendar embarrassingly empty. Driving gave me something like order. You start the engine, the dashboard lights up, the app chirps, and for a few hours you can pretend you're just part of the city's bloodstream. Chicago smelled like damp stone and burnt espresso that night, the kind of cold that sticks to the edges of your jacket. When the app pulsed in my hand, I trusted it, trusted that whatever showed up in the queue would be normal, human, explainable. I wasn't ready for the moment the normal broke. I remember the car, same gray Toyota, same faint burn mark by the cup holder, same peppermint air freshener twisting gently from the mirror. The blanket in the back still had a couple dog hairs from my sister's mutt. The heater clicked in that uneven winter way. I remember all the small things because later they would become proof that I was still anchored in the real world when something not real stepped into it. The first ping came at 10:14 p.m. Ordinary. A student named Tom, hoodie, backpack, a tired hey. He talked about a midterm the way people talk when they're half in the moment and half drowning in deadlines. Seatbelt click, zipper scrape, the faint metallic rattle of whatever he carried in that bag. The streets were crowded enough. Nurses heading home, bar noise spilling out of open doors, a vendor folding up his roasted corn stand under the lamplight. Maria, another driver I knew, waved from her car as she waited for a fare. She texted me later, "You catching the late rush too?" I wish I'd known then what I know now, that the real story wasn't the first fare, or the second. It was the third ping, the one at 11:47 p.m. under the Kennedy overpass, that would carve its way into my memory. The moment that made me realize the sentence that's been lodged in my head ever since. He didn't belong to this world. And I don't mean that as a metaphor. I mean it the way you mean it when every instinct you have starts screaming the same thing. He tipped with the app, a small digital pat on the back, and left me with the kind of aftertaste ordinary people leave. Neutral, slightly warm. The meter chimed as he logged out. I remember the light on his face swallowed by the glow of a street-level Starbucks sign. Someone else would pick him up in 10 minutes. That's the rhythm. Door, ride, goodbye. Ordinary people get in and out of cars. Sometimes they leave an aftertaste. Sometimes they leave nothing at all. The second was quieter, a little stranger, but still harmless. Alina, she told me her name when she slid open the rear door, carried a violin case like it was a sleeping animal. She smelled faintly of rosin and lemon hand soap. When she sat down, she hummed a scale under her breath, an almost inaudible sequence that made the inside of the car feel like a practice room. She asked, politely, if I could turn my playlist down. She hummed a little more as we moved, and for a few minutes the world narrowed to the sound of tires and the ghost of a melody. She had steady, careful hands. When I asked about where she was headed, a friend's apartment near Fullerton, she gave me the address and, without making it a story, said she stayed late rehearsing. I thought about rehearsal rooms and leaning shoulders, about how some people carry music like a second skin. She paid, left a small tip, and as she left, she slipped a folded paper into my palm. "Just a busking schedule," she laughed, and told me to come by if I was ever wandering aimlessly downtown. Her violin case closed with a soft click. The car felt 30% lighter after she left. Those 2 rides should have been all the story needed, the kind of night where nothing unusual happens at all. But small things pile. A man humming while he rides, a hoodie that smells faintly of laundry detergent, the way a person bends to retrieve a dropped phone, all of it accumulates, like pebbles in a pocket. You don't notice the weight until you empty your pockets and something heavy rolls out. There were two other moments that night, short, odd edges to the shift that I didn't understand until later. One was with a woman named Leela. Indefinable when exactly she got in, I only remembered the way her eyes seemed to hold a reflection of light like someone who had been watching from a distance for a long time. She'd been coming from a funeral. She said that quietly, without volume, like a fact reported in weather. She sat in the back and told me nothing I could repeat. When she got out, she walked away with a stiffness that made me think of people who leave rooms and never look back. Later, at a memorial on social media, someone mentioned seeing a man with glass eyes standing at a curb near the funeral. The phrase lodged in my head. The other was Jason, indefinable as to the timing, but the sound he made is unforgettable. He wore a suit that looked like it belonged to someone earlier in the evening who had not yet reconciled himself to the late hour. He whistled the same small tune over and over, a little toy melody that didn't match any song I knew. The repetition of it made the car feel smaller. He was polite, left a tip, and walked off into a street of closed storefronts, still whistling. A strange tune, once heard, tends to hang around the back of your skull. Both of those small, odd things were like scratches on a record, little imperfections that hinted something further. The app pinged for Martin at 11:47 p.m. That is a time I can still feel, not because of the digits themselves, but because of the way the city was ordered around it. Most of the restaurants were shuttered. The overpass hummed with traffic above us like a constant but distant threat. The pickup point was under the Kennedy, a place where the light is always clinical and the echoes are a little too long. The marker on my screen read Martin, just a username attached to a small photo of indefinito. The map showed him standing under that wash of sodium lamp, half in shadow, half in a pool of traffic light. I pulled up, more out of habit than expectation. You go where the app tells you. That's how you survive the nights. I clicked arrived, waited, and saw the rear door open. He climbed into the back seat, not through the sliding door, but the usual one, and sat, slowly, like someone who had not had much to do with sitting for a long time. He wore a dark coat. He smelled faintly of something the brain wants to name and can't. Cold pennies, old paper, the kind of smell that belongs to basements. He said only one word as the door latched: drive. It was the single syllable of a command and a plea, both. No hello, no thanks, no destination. I felt in that half-second that something about the car had changed. The radio seemed to drop a frequency. I remember glancing in the rear view and seeing his face half swallowed by shadow. His eyes caught the dim overhead light, and there was a slipperiness to the way he looked, like a film over glass. I told him, "Where to?" in that automatic voice drivers use when the conversation is small and the road is long. He pointed without moving his head. The route appeared on my GPS, and I started to pull away. I lock the doors habitually. It's a safety thing you learn after a few years driving, a click that means you're not as exposed. That night, the lock sounded especially loud. The peppermint air freshener swung once and stopped. The city unspooled itself, an ink line across my windshield. For the first few minutes, the ride was clinical. The meters, the green dots, the turns. His hands were folded in his lap, pale, with the kind of looseness that should have been easy to dislodge but wasn't. I told a stupid joke about traffic. He didn't laugh. I asked if he wanted the heat on a little more. He nodded once. His voice, when he did speak, was small and thin. He did not offer a destination in words. His pointing had been enough. The GPS showed us veering away from the main roads and under a stretch of overpass where bottles had been kicked into gutters and the light smelled like ancient sodium. I'd driven that stretch 100 times. You learn the microgeography of a city on night shifts, where the potholes hide, which stoplights have the longest red, where cops like to sit in cruisers. You can place yourself by the pattern of things you see. But that night, the small, known geography felt off, like walking through a familiar house and finding one chair in a different room. About 10 minutes into the ride, I noticed a small wetness at the corner of his mouth. It was a tiny thing, a bead of something that had gathered and glittered under the streetlight for a moment before vanishing. I mentioned it because I'm a driver, and we notice those things. "You okay back there?" I kept my hands on the wheel, turned the radio down a notch so we were lower than the world. He closed his mouth and did not answer. His eyelids were slack in a way I had rarely seen. They rested in a half-closedness that no one keeps when they are awake. I moved my gaze quickly, like checking a rear view for a sudden lane change, and the small abnormalities began to compile. His breathing, which had been regular, started to take on a thin, irregular cadence. His jaw hung a millimeter open. His skin had lost a warmth I would later describe to the officer as cool to the touch, but that night I could only register as wrong. I had a sudden, almost ridiculous urge to turn on every interior light in the car and flood his features with brightness. I resisted that because drivers learn not to do things that might make passengers feel watched. I pulled over at a curb where the sidewalk widened and the sodium light fell like an accusation. I put the car in park and said, louder this time, "Hey, are you okay, sir?" He didn't respond. The app still showed the route and ticked the seconds. I opened the rear door, expecting a protest, an explanation, maybe a joke. Instead, when I placed my hand on his wrist, the beat I was looking for was not there. There is a precise, horrible clarity to that moment. In emergencies, you go through reflexes like a checklist: look, call, compress, protect. I remember grabbing his wrist and feeling skin that was cool, then feeling the car tilt into a silence so absolute I could hear the heater take a breath. I checked for a pulse again at the carotid because you do not trust a peripheral feel in dim light. My fingers searched and found nothing. I remember the sound of my own breath and the app's little chirp coming from the dashboard like an indifferent metronome. I did the things drivers are taught to do: call 911 and notify the app. My hands trembled in a way I didn't like. The voice on the 911 line was calm and procedural, the kind of calm that seems trained to hold the world steady for other people's collapses. I told her where we were. I told her there was a man unresponsive in my back seat. The dispatcher told me to begin compressions if I could, to check the airway, to have someone nearby flag the approaching EMS units. I remember saying, I don't know CPR well, because it's the awful, useless honesty people offer when systems are failing them. A man on the sidewalk came over, Marcus, he later told the officer, who had been smoking and watching traffic. He put his hands on my shoulders in a way that felt steady. He said the right things, or maybe no words at all. He was one of those friends you suddenly discover you have out of nowhere. When people arrive in emergency situations, they do the small tasks that are obvious. They call for help, they hold a flashlight, they do chest compressions. Marcus began to do compressions as if he'd been born knowing exactly where to put his hands. Another passerby shouted into the street for someone to call an ambulance. Someone else banged on the hood of a passing car until the noise sent a siren wailing into being. I flagged the ride in the app and hit the emergency button, which is a weirdly numbing action. The screen acknowledges with a line of text and offers an automated link to the company's incident reporting. I typed, with my thumbs shaking, a bare sentence: passenger unresponsive, no pulse. The app pinged back an automated response and told me someone from support would reach out. It felt absurd. The technology that had connected me to that man now sat on the dashboard as a pale mediator between human panic and municipal services. Officer Ramirez was the first cop to arrive, blue leather and the smell of diesel, light stroking the overpass. She moved with a kind of practiced economy. Quick questions, short notations, a flashlight directed at eyes. EMT Sarah came with her bag, a small woman with a face that already knew how to organize disaster, and she worked methodically. She checked airway, breathing, and circulation with the kind of speed that makes emergency care feel like a choreography. When she pronounced it, she used the phrase "no vital signs." And even now, the memory of her saying it sounds like a footstep in a hallway you used to live in and now visit only by appointment. They wrapped the protocols around the scene: photographs of the car, swabs, the way first responders mark time and place. The coroner was not yet on site, but would be. The ambulance's back doors were bright and giving. The EMTs moved with efficient tenderness. I remember Officer Ramirez asking me for my card, for the app logs, for a timeline. She told me she'd need a statement, and I felt both grateful for the structure and objectified by it. My memory reduced to times and times alone. She made notes and said she would coordinate with the detective on call. At one point, while the lights from the ambulance painted the underpass in rapid strobes, I thought of the phrase again. He didn't belong to this world. It came to me not as a supernatural conclusion, but as an impression, a stubborn, unscientific image of an element that seemed older than the pavement, out of sync with the ordinary economy of the night. There was something in the way his hands had folded, in the dull film over his eyes, that suggested a discordant origin, nothing anyone could put a label on. That feeling sat beside the clinical facts. The two things did not cancel each other out. They overlapped and made a region of blurry certainty where neither science nor superstition could live comfortably. Marcus talked to Ramirez near the trunk of my car. Maria texted me from a block away. She had been on shift earlier and had my number, an extra lifeline drivers share because we talk too much to strangers and too little to each other. Kevin, the dispatcher from the app company, called my phone and left a voicemail offering counseling and instructions about preserving ride data. The company's automated response had already flagged the ride for review. There was procedure for all of this, piles of it. The EMS report, photographs, a chain of custody for the personal effects, app logs preserved for law enforcement. Even amid the shock, the city insisted on paperwork. Somebody took my coat and offered me coffee that was a little too bitter. A reporter named Jenna showed up later, indefinable when exactly, and asked if I had anything to say. I remember telling her, in that flat way you tell a stranger facts, that the man had been unresponsive at pickup. She asked if I believed in anything supernatural. I said I didn't know how to answer that because I had felt something in the car, and still felt it when I closed my eyes. She took notes and smiled like someone collecting elements for a headline. Detective Lewis would take my statement the next morning, but not tonight. Tonight was the blur of sirens, the coroner's eventual bag zipped, the slow unwinding of the scene that leaves objects in its wake. A cup with a lipstick ring, a folded receipt, the faint impression of a thumbprint. Police taped off the curb. Someone left a candle on the sidewalk and a small bouquet that looked out of place in the urban detritus. The app company later archived server records and offered counseling to drivers involved in the incident. The city later debated policy changes, dash cam regulations, safety buttons. For now, the curb held our shared bewilderment. I remember the coroner's bag being handled with a kind of respectful silence. I did not see what happened inside of it. That image is something people like to invent when they feel unsatisfied by ambiguity. What I remember is the zipper, the sound it made, single, solemn, and the way the bag was carried with an economy of motion like it had been designed to move grief without letting it spill. In the hours that followed the ride, while the street cleared and the app resumed its indifferent pings to other drivers who did not know anything about what had happened under the Kennedy, my hands felt foreign. I had always prided myself on being steady, on treating the city like a series of tasks rather than a theater of possible calamity. That neat division had been ruptured. The suggestion that someone could be in your car, close enough to touch, and slip away without an explanation loosened something inside me. The city's anonymity had suddenly become a liability. I remember the coroner's bag being handled with a kind of respectful silence. I did not see what happened inside of it. That image is something people like to invent when they feel unsatisfied by ambiguity. What I remember is the zipper, the sound it made, single, solemn, and the way the bag was carried with an economy of motion like it had been designed to move grief without letting it spill. In the hours that followed the ride, while the street cleared and the app resumed its indifferent pings to other drivers who did not know anything about what had happened under the Kennedy, my hands felt foreign. I had always prided myself on being steady, on treating the city like a series of tasks rather than a theater of possible calamity. That neat division had been ruptured. The suggestion that someone could be in your car, close enough to touch, and slip away without an explanation loosened something inside me. The city's anonymity had suddenly become a liability. People asked later, friends, family, my parents, what I had done wrong. That's an instinct we have, to search for fault. I kept telling them the list of things I had done right. I pulled over, I called 911, I flagged the ride, I didn't move the passenger from the seat, I waited for EMS. Those are the ordered measures that separate reaction from panic. They kept me anchored when the world wanted to tilt. In the quiet that followed, hours before sleep roped me into a kind of exhausted wakefulness. I sat in my car and thought about those 2 earlier odd rides. Leela with the funeral and her glass eyes, Jason with his repeating whistle. They were small, almost meaningless vignettes until placed by the night next to something that needed explanation. Once Martin was added to the ledger, those earlier scratches on the record acquired weight. That is how the mind works in cities. It patterns, it arranges, it persuades itself of connections, because otherwise randomness is unbearable. I closed the car door, and the night seemed to press against the glass. The peppermint air freshener hung still. The heater clicked and settled into its mechanical rhythm. My keys were in my hand, that cheap, jangling comfort of metal at the moment when you realize an ordinary object can also be a talisman. I remember thinking that the world, at its edges, is both fragile and stubbornly indifferent. There are things that happen and are explained by time and tests, and there are impressions that hover without resolution. Both can exist at once. I drove home slow, the city's lights sliding past like a kind of montage. In my rear view, the overpass receded, and the scene became a patch in memory's map. I knew even then that the story would take on other lives, a police report, a coroner's finding, the app's internal review. I did not know what the toxicology would eventually say. I knew only that I could not shake the image of a face half swallowed by shadow, and a single word: drive. When I finally slept, it was not sleep, but a sequence of small blackouts. Dreams were fragments of song and light, and a man who did not answer. I woke with the taste of metallic fear in my mouth. The next day, the city had its own business. The app pinged with routine jobs, while my hands shook slightly as I reached for the steering wheel. Maria texted me and asked if I was okay. Kevin from support checked in and repeated the company line: archived logs, counseling, will assist. Officer Ramirez requested a follow-up statement, and Detective Lewis said they'd be in touch. What changed, practically? I installed a dash cam that records the back seat. I started carrying a pocket-sized CPR guide and practiced compressions on a training pad Maria lent me. I joined a small drivers group that traded safety tips and sometimes coffee. The app added a faster pathway to an emergency flag. Officer Ramirez requested a follow-up statement, and Detective Lewis said they'd be in touch. What changed, practically? I installed a dash cam that records the back seat. I started carrying a pocket-sized CPR guide and practiced compressions on a training pad Maria lent me. I joined a small drivers group that traded safety tips and sometimes coffee. The app added a faster pathway to an emergency flag. What changed, practically? Detective Lewis took notes later and would confirm that standard procedures were followed. For now, the night itself had decided to withhold the rest. The ambulance pulled away eventually, lights folding into the dark like a wing. Officer Ramirez closed the notebook and jotted a case number into the tablet, the same gesture you make when you want to believe order can be re-established. The crowd thinned. Marcus patted my shoulder and said, "You did what you could," like something incantatory. Maria stood by the curb and lit a cigarette with a jagged hand, the city filling in the gaps with routine and indifference. I drove home with the radio mute and the streets whispering past, each light a small interrogation. Midnight had arrived, and the world had not changed on its axis, yet everything in me had been rearranged. I told myself the things the city's institutions told me. There would be a report, there would be science, there would be closure of sorts. But when I parked the car and turned off the engine, the silence that followed was not quiet. It was a kind of low-grade alarm. That's where I left it when morning came, with a list of things to do and a feeling lodged like a pebble. And that feeling kept speaking its single sentence. He didn't belong to this world, like a small, stubborn echo that refuses to be explained away by reports and toxicology and official language. Weeks later, the lab returned a result that put a clinical frame around the night. Detective Lewis called me at a time I remember because the light was flat and I had been staring at my steering wheel, practicing the same 2 breaths over and over. He read the line the report had reached: probable cardiac arrest with contributing substances. He said it with the kind of professional economy that makes painful things sound smaller by fitting them into categories. I thanked him the way you thank someone who has given you information you did not want and needed anyway. That language, probable cardiac arrest with contributing substances, does what it must. It tells you that people died because bodies fail in certain ways, and that tests were able to find markers that could help explain how that happens. It does not answer the other question I kept asking myself: why did he seem so out of phase, so misaligned with the rest of the world? The medical conclusion and my feeling sat next to one another like 2 neighbors who never speak but continue to acknowledge each other across a fence. Once the toxicology returned, the public part of the story started to fray into smaller pieces. Jenna's piece ran, not sensational, but human, an account that stitched my nervous recollection to verified steps. She quoted the procedural elements: a 911 call, EMS on scene, coroner involvement, and she also, delicately, noted how drivers cope with the aftermath when the city's anonymity is suddenly personal. People commented. Some offered condolences. Some offered numbers to hotlines or links about cardiac events. A few wrote things that were cruel in ways people think are private. I learned, in the small hours of a scrolling night, that an incident under an overpass will attract both sympathy and speculation in roughly equal measures. The app company's follow-up was formal and, in its own way, staged, the kind of corporate compassion that has a form you can expect. Kevin from support called again, then texted a resource link. The company archived the ride logs and offered counseling as promised. They recommended procedures for preserving evidence and reminded me to save anything relevant from my phone. I used the counseling offer. The first appointment was awkward and then useful. A trained listener helped me name what had happened as both an event and a trauma. The counselor suggested sleep hygiene, grounding exercises, and that I spend time with people who could keep me anchored. I took the suggestion to heart. I called Maria and we met for coffee. We did not talk about spiritual things. We compared lists: what to do if a passenger goes quiet, how to flag a ride, the new emergency features the app had been testing. At the drivers' group meeting that week, people who had never met in person exchanged stories the way sailors swap sea tales. Someone else had a night shift story with a sudden collapse. Another driver talked about a passenger who'd passed out from hypoglycemia and woke up naming a childhood pet. We compared insurance helplines and dashcam models. I told the group what happened and kept to the facts. Maria sat beside me and made the small gestures that mean you are not alone. She brought a thermos of coffee and an extra sweatshirt. Marcus, who had been a stranger on the sidewalk and is now a name in my phone, sent a message from time to time. He wanted to know how I'd slept. He said simply, "You did the right things." There were small policy ripples too. The app accelerated a pilot for a faster emergency flag and started emailing drivers about safety kits. Local advocates pressed the city council for better lighting under certain overpasses. Meetings happened, boring, earnest, necessary meetings where people in suits and people with cold hands argued about budgets and outcomes. None of that fixed the way the underpass looked in my mind, but it produced change in a transactional way. Better lighting in a few zones, an informational campaign for drivers about nearby hospitals, a suggestion to make counseling more accessible. I found, in the weeks that followed, that the narrative of the night could be rewired in other people's mouths. To some friends, the story became a parable about vulnerability, a reminder that we are all fragile. To others, it became an illustration of the risks of working alone at night. Social media insisted on filling gaps with speculation. Someone mentioned overdoses, someone else argued for more patrols, and a few people offered spiritual explanations I could neither accept nor dismiss. I tried to keep my own voice small and tethered to the documented facts. The app pinged at 11:47 p.m., the pickup under the Kennedy, the single word he said, my check for a pulse, EMT Sarah and Officer Ramirez at the scene, the coroner's bag zipped and removed, Detective Lewis's follow-up. Those are things you can verify if you look at the reports. Everything else sits in the space between two recorded breaths. The sleeping thing was the hardest for me. Nights used to be a place of clarity where I could listen to playlists and think through problems. After that ride, they felt like waiting rooms. I would wake in the small hours convinced I heard a soft whistling and find only the refrigerator's hum. I started to practice CPR routinely, not with any expectation I'd be called on to perform it again, but because the physical act of practicing gave me a sense of agency. I bought a CPR pocket guide and carried it in the glove compartment. Maria lent me a training pad, and we did drills in a parking lot until both our palms ached. The mechanical repetition steadied the shaking that was not apparent to everyone else. At odd moments, the two earlier rides, Leela and Jason, kept returning to me in new shapes. A comment thread on a memorial post described someone at a curb with glassy eyes and a coat like a shadow. I could not confirm whether that was him. The repeating whistle that had lodged itself in my skull seemed to resonate every time a distant radio played a simple melody. People told me, kindly or not, that the mind builds patterns because it prefers order to randomness. Sometimes that is a comfort, sometimes a trap. For my part, I learned to hold both possibilities, that the earlier encounters were mere coincidences, and that my unconscious had been assembling a mosaic where the pieces only made sense after the fact. There were practical changes to the way I worked. I installed a dash cam that records the back seat. Once it was in place, I watched the footage of other rides late at night and felt both safer and more exposed. The camera's perspective was candid and less haunting than memory. The lighting flattened faces into rectangles, small details clarified themselves, and the terror I had felt with Martin did not unspool into anything other than what it had been, a human tragedy with procedural consequences. That view helped sometimes. It did not nullify the feeling of discord I still carried, but it prevented me from rewriting reality to match the fear. Detective Lewis remained in touch enough for me to feel that the case had not simply evaporated into a database. He answered questions I had about evidence handling and ensured me that all standard processes had been followed at the scene. He explained that the coroner's office had to wait for toxicology and other tests. He did not speculate about anything beyond what the lab had reported. The communication felt clinical and, at times, soothing because it replaced silence with a timeline. I kept a folder on my phone and in my email where I saved every message or document that related to that night: the app's incident acknowledgement, Kevin's voicemail offering support, the police report number, the receipt of the tow, small artifacts that made the event feel anchored. I also kept Marcus's number and a screenshot of his first text. He'd written, "If you need to talk, call." Those little things were not evidence in a lab sense, but they were the scaffolding that kept me from dissolving into something less steady. People asked me if I ever considered leaving driving behind. It's a reasonable question. The work had become the site of a profound shock. I did not stop driving. What changed was the ritual around it. I would check my rearview mirror more often, practice clear, friendly openings with passengers, keep the car lighter of clutter so I could move quickly, and make sure my emergency procedures were within reach. I told regulars, those faces that returned,
that I'd taken a class and that the company had updated emergency protocols. 10 drivers in my circle installed dash cams. We stopped shrugging off odd moments as inconsequential. There was, unavoidably, a period where people tried to fold the story into metaphors. A few of my parents' friends used it as a warning. Don't drive late. Don't sit in silence with strangers. That's one way to respond to grief, by attempting to legislate it out of the world. Another response I found more helpful: small acts of preparations and mutual aid among drivers. If a stranger feels wrong in the back seat, call for help. If you see someone loitering under an overpass, report it if it makes you uneasy. Those suggestions are mundane and imperfect, but they're useful because they allow us to do something rather than merely feel something. In private, the feeling that he didn't belong to this world did not leave me. Over time, it changed shape. It became a shorthand for the mismatch I had experienced. A person in a car who seemed, in some intangible way, to be outside the set of assumptions I carry about other people. I would not assert any metaphysical explanation. The toxicology provided an answer the court of hospital records accepted. Still, the impression lingered, like a scent that no amount of windows-down air can fully remove. I learned to live with that residue. Sometimes, in the small hours when the city is a patterned hush of refrigeration and distant traffic, I replay the scene not to solve it, but to find a place where it stops hurting to remember. The recorder of my life, the dashcam now, the app's digital traces, offers a flat fidelity that memory does not. Memory layers emotion over fact. The footage does not.
Watching the play of headlights on a hood in grainy video is different from recollecting the way his eyelids lay like half-closed blinds. Both are true in their own registers. There was, as well, a human kindness that arrived in modest forms. A woman who runs a late-night diner left a note and a small cup at the curb the following week, for the man who had a rough night. Someone left a candle that looked like a votive, and then, several days later, someone else took it away. These gestures mattered because they transformed a scene into something communal rather than merely transactional. The city, even in its anonymity, found ways to be tender. I do not want to romanticize the trauma. Trauma is a real recalibration of how you move in the world. It made me more careful, yes. It also made me more likely to feel dread when a passenger was silent. It made me attend to small physiological details, breath, skin temperature, response to sound, that I had not noticed before. It made me call my mother on certain nights and say, "I'll be home soon," in a way that felt more like an incantation than a plan. Eventually, the official ledger closed to a degree. The case file was given a final status that fit the lab findings and the coroner's report. There was no criminal investigation beyond the usual inquiries, no arrests, no charges, because the coroner's office had determined there were medical factors involved. Detective Lewis said the evidence supported that conclusion. The city and the app company moved forward with their respective measures. Life, in the city's larger sense, resumed its noisy patterns. But my private ledger kept an open line. I still have the small, inconvenient images, the peppermint freshener dangling like a tiny buoy, the heater's soft sigh, the app's chirp that had once felt like a heartbeat and now felt like a metronome marking time. When I tell the story to friends or to groups of drivers, I emphasize procedures. Call 911, flag the ride, do not move the person, preserve evidence, and practice CPR. I tell them that the institutional response is there, that the company will often offer counseling, and that logging everything helps both your legal position and your peace of mind. And then I tell them what the reports could not communicate, the sensation that lodged in me, the odd conviction that he did not belong to this world. I frame it carefully. It is a felt image, a poetic shorthand for the mismatch between his demeanor and the rhythm I expect from people in my car. I make sure to say that the toxicology and the coroner's findings provided a medical explanation for his death. I do not claim any other reality for him. What I claim is the experience, how something about him, his eyes, the way his skin had cooled, the single word he offered, left me with a sense of wrongness that was stubbornly resistant to explanation. People ask if I ever speak his name now. The app's user label was Martin, and that is the name I type into the report lines, the name I say when recounting the event for journalists or the police. Outside of paperwork, I use it rarely, because names have a way of making things more intimate than they deserve. Sometimes, when I am driving and a passenger tells me to drive, I think of that syllable and feel my chest tighten. It is not guilt, it is an echo. There is a memorial post still active somewhere, threaded into a map of grief and opinion. Someone once messaged me, anonymously, and said they had seen something at the funeral described as a man with glass eyes. That kind of message is always indefinable in origin. You cannot verify it, but it feeds a human appetite for patterns. I do not allow stories like that to become the main thing. They remain peripheral, interesting perhaps, but not evidentiary. If there is anything I want you to take away beyond the specific facts, it is this: cities transmogrify our sense of responsibility. The person in your rear seat is both a stranger and a person whose life and death, in a moment, will touch you. You cannot control every outcome. You can, however, take steps that make you less helpless. A dash cam may not make you less grief-struck, but it may help keep the record straight. A CPR class won't guarantee you'll save a life, but it will change the way you respond. Keeping numbers, friends like Marcus, colleagues like Maria, and a counselor, offers a different kind of first aid for the mind. I kept my own list of practical changes because they steadied me. Install a dash cam, practice CPR, keep a small first aid kit, create a digital folder for incident documentation, use the app's emergency flag without hesitation, lean on community resources, and accept counseling if it's offered. Those are mundane instructions. They are small, but they are also actionable, and action is often the only antidote to the private spinning of terror. There are nights, even now, when I pull into an empty lot and sit for a few minutes before turning the engine off. I listen to the heater cycle, watch the mirror for the simple geometry of the street, and let the silence feel like a thing that can be tolerated. The memory of that single command, drive, does not evaporate. It lives alongside other small objects I keep. A screenshot of Kevin's voicemail, Marcus's number, the police report number, a bank of receipts from the night. They are both talismans and anchors. If you have a story like this, if you woke up suddenly in the middle of the night and felt the world tilt, there is a way to tell it that helps both you and those who need to hear. Keep it short, keep the facts, and then tell the feeling in one sentence. If you want to share yours here, use the format that helps us gather small truths into a larger map. Post in the comments with this format: I was in my car, I was on a train, month, one sentence about the feeling. I read them. I will not promise to respond to every one, but I will read them, because the act of listening matters. In the end, the city continues to be a place where routine and rupture sit side by side. The underpass is where it was, concrete, humming, lit in that weird sodium amber. The coroner's forms found closure in a lab's language. Practical changes happened because people insisted they should. And there remains, in my pocket and persistent as a loose coin, the sentence that will probably never fully leave me. He didn't belong to this world. I say it as an impression, not a conclusion, a way of naming the uncanny register of that night that resists tidy explanations. It is both a confession and a small private fact about how I now carry the city with me.